Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It's my pleasure today to welcome Asher Lovy, who is a very important personality in our overall community for the mere fact that he has become one of the addresses for advocacy to try to resolve a problem that we don't talk a lot about, but that unfortunately exists within our community, and that's sexual abuse. Asher grew up in Borough Park. Unfortunately, he is also a victim of abuse, but fortunately, he's a survivor of the abuse, and he has taken it to the next level by trying to help other people. And I thank him for joining me. He is not, he recognizes the sanctuary behind me because he has davened with us in KINS, even though he does live on the East Coast. And Asher, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. So sometimes when I read the statistics of what really happens, and I know this is a complicated subject for a lot of people, it's not only disturbing, it's hard to believe. And so one of the statistics that I know is always front and center is a statistic that 1 in 5 girls has been sexually abused and 1 in 20 boys. Is that statistic also applied to the Jewish community as much as the general community?
It's an interesting question, and I'm glad you asked it. It's also a complicated question because one of the things about our community is that we resist study. So it's very difficult to get accurate data. The closest I've seen is there's a Dr. David Rosmarin in Harvard who was doing a long-term study on the effects of religious observance in community on mental health outcomes. And over the course of his 5-year study, he incidentally asked his group if they had experienced sexual abuse. The numbers he got indicated that the rate may even be higher, but because of the way that the populations were segmented, the data it's not a definitive set for that purpose, at least. He concluded in his study that there's no reason to believe that the prevalence is any different. And I tend to agree with that overall, but I think I think we should operate with the assumption that our prevalence is at least the same. But I would say also that in my experience, prevalence tends to go up if you are in a community, and this is not necessarily a community of the size of ours. It could be a community as small as, a neighborhood, a shul, a school, any community in which there's an air of impunity. There's going to be a higher incidence rate of sexual abuse. If an abuser knows that they can abuse and probably get away with it, it's more likely that people are going to abuse in that community rather than a community in which people take it seriously, believe the victims, encourage them to report and support them through the process.
Now, you've been the director of Xhaka, which is spelled Zaaka, which deals specifically with this scourge on society since 2016. So you have at least a decade of perspective on it. Is this something that has gotten worse or better? If I were to turn back the clock 50 years, would I be seeing the same kind of issues?
I think that this issue has always existed, but we haven't necessarily had the language to talk about it. And that's one of the areas of change that's been the most striking over the last, I'd say, 20 years in the community. The fact that sexual abuse is a phrase that we are allowed to speak out loud is a tremendous change. That said, that's the positive side of it. One of the negative sides of this is that, as with any change in our community, it's often that we gravitate toward approaches that don't necessarily hold us to account on a systemic level. Like, we, for example, if you take the recent Walder case, there's been a lot of clamoring about, not have, even in the Haredi world, across the Orthodox world, there's been a clamoring to remove his books from our literary canon, so to speak, our modern, literary canon for kids and for adults. It's great, but there hasn't really been much of a push to implement any sort of systemic change, which is the part that's the most difficult. So at the bottom, there's been a tremendous amount of change in terms of general awareness, in terms of people knowing what their options are, in terms of people understanding the issue more. Obviously, there's more work to be done, but from the top down, there's been a lot less progress.
And again, when you define sexual abuse, is it's a sexual physical abuse, or can it also be a question of sexual psychological abuse?
So it kind of encompasses the nebula of everything that goes into sexual abuse, right? So it could be something that's physical, could be something that's penetrative, non-penetrative, underclothes, overclothes. It could be showing a child some pornography, whether that's pornography of adults or of children. It could be taking child pornography images. It could be the grooming process as well. Speaking to children about stuff that's inappropriate. It could be stuff that's, that isn't itself per se abuse, but is like sort of on the road to it. Basically, there's a ramp up typically in most abuse cases. There's a grooming process that includes a steady linear breach of boundaries until the actual thing itself, the actual abuse, becomes something that that's normal in the life of the child in the context of their relationship with the abuser. So all of that, I would say, is encompassed by sexual abuse.
And victims of abuse, in terms of what Xhaka does Xhaka provide for them counseling, therapy, support, or is it more of a triage kind of piece, getting them out of the situation, making people aware of situations?
So we don't provide any, the only service we directly provide is not specifically for survivors of sexual abuse. We run a Shabbos and Yom Tov mental health peer support hotline that started in April of 2020, when the 3-day Yom Tov during the lockdowns happened, and there was a clamor among the Rabbanim in the Orthodox world to set something up. So we set that hotline up in response to the need for someone to be on the other end of someone who needs to reach out. But in terms of our services for survivors, primarily what we do centers around referrals. So a lot of times if someone is sexually abused, most of the people we deal with were sexually abused years before they call us. The sad truth is that most survivors won't disclose to anybody until many, many years later. So that's most of what we deal with. And there are people who need therapy. There are people who need legal resources. Some people have real existential problems and need housing, money, food, emergency resources. And what we basically do is we partner with as many organizations as we can. We vet as many organizations as we can. We have a list of organizations that we can refer to. So someone calls us up and they tell us exactly what's going on in their life. And they tell us what they're looking for, what their needs are, and we try to refer along to other organizations, whether that's a support group or mental health resources, legal resources, housing, or anything else.
And do you serve the entire country or just the New York area?
We serve the community. So if anybody calls us, whether it's in Israel or the UK or anywhere else, really, we'll try to find them a resource. I made a resource referral yesterday for someone in South Africa to an organization in South Africa, right? So we maintain a pretty large network. And we're usually 1 or 2 steps removed from a resource that somebody needs. So if we aren't able to make a referral, we know someone who can. Primarily, our area of focus is the New York and New Jersey area, but obviously, like I said, anyone who calls us, we can find a resource for them. And if we can't, then we're very upfront about that.
And just to make sure we do this a few times, what's the phone number people would call for that hotline?
So the number is the same, whether you're calling for a referral during the week or you're calling for the Shabbos and Yom Tov mental health hotline. It's 888-492-2524. A number that's easier to remember is 888-4-Xhaka, Z-A-A-K-A-H. So 4-Xhaka, or 888-492-2524. And
there are people, you get phone calls every day?
Actually, the phone is not how we get most of our messages. A lot of the messages come through Facebook. An enormous amount of them come through TikTok. Some of them come through Twitter. We maintain a lot of them also come through Instagram. We maintain a very active social media presence because each of those social media apps has a different audience that we're reaching. So for example, with TikTok, we're reaching, more of a Gen Z audience. With Instagram, we're reaching Gen Z and millennials. With Facebook, we're reaching, the millennials and a little bit older. And then there are people who actually call us. On the weekends, though, when we run the Shabbos and Yom Tov hotline, obviously that's phone, but also we have a WhatsApp channel also at the same number, so people can reach out to us on WhatsApp as well, and chat with us on Shabbos if they aren't if for whatever reason they aren't safe to talk on the phone on Shabbos, whether that's because their family doesn't know that they're going through a hard time, or because they're living with someone who's an unsafe person and they need to contact someone in a discreet way.
And was there a real rise in abuse during COVID, during the lockdowns?
There's been, I mean, there's a documented rise in calls to services that help survivors of domestic abuse and sexual violence nationwide, just everywhere. Every single one of them has had it, whether it's the domestic violence hotline, whether it's RAIN's sexual assault hotline. There's been an increase in traffic to crisis text line as well as the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So across the board, there's been an increase in all of that.
And I'm sorry to visit a real case. The most recent case you had already referred to was with Walder. In that kind of case, there seemed to have been an initial denial. Then slowly but surely, more of the Haredi world seemed to come on board of understanding what was happening. I'm sure that, as is true of everything, there are people who will deny things. But when you look at the ultimate response, is it something that makes you more hopeful about the future, or it just was?
It's an interesting question. We set up an emergency hotline to deal with people who were having a hard time processing Walder, right? And it seemed really for the first time in the 10 years I've been doing any of this work, that this was the first time that a lot of people in the Orthodox world, particularly in the Haredi world, were confronted by a case of sexual abuse in a way that affected them personally, that they couldn't look away from or make excuses for. So in that sense, like dealing with people individually, you know, both watching what was going on social media, but also the way Xhaka was dealing with it, was you were seeing that people were engaging more, they were more aware, and they were willing to hear information that they wouldn't necessarily have been able to hear otherwise. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a disconnect between the grassroots, so to speak, the everyday person, and the leadership at the top level, right? So as you said, there was the initial instinct on the part of leadership was to deny it, except for Shmuel Eliyahu, who really pushed. And then slowly, there was an acknowledgement, and Walder was fired from Yated and Kol Chai, and you know, and then he died, and there was an immediate withdrawal of that. The Rabbanim, I mean, almost uniformly, top Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael, aside from, you know, a handful, pulled back their condemnations of Walder. And then slowly, after they saw, you know, after the unfortunate death of Shifra Horovitz, you saw them realizing that they'd made a mistake. And a lot of that was driven by outrage from people at the bottom, which I think in that sense, there's progress, because that wouldn't have happened, I think, 10 or 15 years ago. But what's been concerning about the response institutionally since then is that not necessarily on the part of more to the center and left of modern Orthodoxy, but everything from the right wing of modern Orthodoxy rightward, there seems to be this concerted institutional response that's hinging more around, less around the systemic problems that result in cover-ups, that result in people being ashamed to come forward, that result in the lack of resources for abuse victims, and more focused on creating things like special Batei Din. Like Rav Zev Cohen gave an interview to Mishpacha, and Rav Lopiansky wrote an article in Mishpacha, both essentially saying the same thing, that, you know, the Rabbanim, for whatever reason, aren't dealing with it, and instead of criticizing the Rabbanim and forcing them to deal with it, they say, well, our hands are tied, therefore we need to have a special beis din. We don't need a special beis din. We really don't. The solution isn't beis din. The solution is to fix our problems that make our community difficult to exist in as a survivor in the first place.
Well, what are those things that need to get fixed for survivors?
So I would say a very good place to start, and this is what I recommend, not just in the Orthodox world, not just in the Haredi world, but I actually worked on a law that mandated this in public schools in New York, because I believe this is extremely important. We need to start by educating children about abuse prevention, and what that does is, it's not, you know, there used to be this idea that you teach kids about stranger danger and you teach them about good and bad touch, and you've kind of covered your bases. But research showed that actually wasn't very effective, especially since most abuse doesn't happen in an outside setting. Most of it isn't institutional. Most of it isn't happening by strangers. And in acknowledgement of the complex grooming process, there's been a shift in the education to teach children about, proper boundaries, body autonomy, the fact that they have a right to decide how people interact with them. Children have a right, for example, to say, I don't want to be hugged right now. I don't want to be tickled. I don't want my cheeks pinched. I don't. And like all of those stuff are relatively innocuous, but what it does is it fosters within the child and within the community around them this sense that, that children are to be taken seriously in terms of their body autonomy, and they're to be taken seriously when they say they're uncomfortable. And one of the reasons why this is so important is because in creating this I guess protection around a child, you create a community that has to commit to it as well. So you're teaching children this, and they're going home and they're expecting to be able to talk to their parents about it, and that their parents are going to listen to them. Their parents have to make sure that the family around them is listening to the child's boundaries and is taking them seriously, and is ready to take a child seriously if they tell an adult in their family that something made them uncomfortable. Teachers in a school that where this is being taught have to understand that as well, and they also have to be educated in how to recognize signs of sexual abuse, but also how to handle a disclosure properly. Many teachers in many states are mandated to report, right? So all of this is part of an abuse prevention education curriculum, and because teachers, parents, and children under such a model would be learning the same things, you inevitably create a community that understands sexual abuse, that takes it seriously, and is there for survivors of it in a real way. And then I would say the next thing that has to happen, and this is not necessarily in any specific order, but another thing that has to happen is we have to, as a community, dedicate ourselves to providing resources for survivors. We tend to deprioritize that. Xhaka was founded as not initially as a victim service organization or as a victims advocacy organization necessarily. It was founded as a group of people who were protesting the internet at CIFA in New York. For those who don't know, it happened in 2012. There were a bunch of communities across the Haredi world that pooled their resources to rent Citi Field and declare the internet essentially banned. And the position of the Xhaka founders at the time was, the community is spending a fabulous amount of money on banning the internet, but they aren't spending any money on helping survivors of sexual abuse. We should be spending that money. It shouldn't fall to organizations like Xhaka, like Amudim, like the handful of other organizations out there that have to fight tooth and nail for every penny that we have. There should be a commitment on the part of the community to provide resources for this. The last piece I would say is that we need to do more to have processes in our institutions and communities that are set up already before something happens. We see a lot of times that there are institutions that and communities that are sort of scrambling in the aftermath of a sexual abuse case to try to figure out what to do, whether it's an accusation against a teacher, whether it's an arrest, a lawsuit, a conviction. There are processes and policies that should be set up in advance that govern the relationships that staff has with staff, that staff has with members or students, or whatever the case may be in the institution, and also govern the process for how you handle a complaint and how you handle a report and how you handle, if someone is arrested or convicted or sued. If those things are in place in advance, it accomplishes two things. First of all, these policies should be publicly available to make everybody feel safe engaging with that institution. And second of all, it creates, it solves a lot of the problems that people are worried about, like what if a report ends up being false? Well, it's not that big a deal, if an investigation is happening, because if this process is in place, we know that the process is good and it's going to be followed. But if it's being made up as you go along, now people can't trust the process anymore, and it becomes a question of who you're trusting in their commentary of what's going on. So between those three pieces, the education piece, providing resources for survivors, and creating policies on an institutional and communal level that we know are going to be followed, what follows from that is a community that together is committed to taking the issue seriously, is committed to supporting people who come forward, and understands enough about the issue not to turn on someone who reports abuse to the authorities.
Now, you were also involved in legislation that reopened this, I don't know the right word, reopened the statute of limitation in New Jersey that has led to additional lawsuits and other things. Is that also what you consider to be part of the solution, that we are able to go back in time and be able to try to right a wrong?
Yeah, so two things about that. First of all, in general, I believe very strongly in accountability. It's very easy to say, going forward, we're going to change because we realize there's a problem. But the only way to really do that is if you look backwards and realize what caused the problem in the first place. And in that sense, the Child Victims Act is very valuable. And that was in both in New York and New Jersey. And New York had, outside of the community, there were a total of 11,000 cases brought against various institutions and people across New York State, not just in the Jewish world, but the Catholics, Boy Scouts, etc. So it's important to look back and to have some sort of accountability, but also the reason we spend so much time fighting for the Child Victims Act was because when I initially started with this work, when I took over, sorry, not even when I took over, before that, when I started doing this work in 2012, I was working at a drop-in center in Midwood, Brooklyn. It's called Our Place. It's a fantastic place, actually, for at-risk kids. I was volunteering there. And the director of the place told me, about 85 to 90% of the children here have been abused. And that just really struck me, especially since the organization was underfunded, like very clearly underfunded. So I thought, what, it must be that the Gedolim, the Rabbanim, just don't know what's going on here. If I go and I talk to them, like, surely they're reasonable people, I could get them to maybe throw some resources here and build some support in the community. I was rebuffed. No one seemed very interested. So I kind of shifted my focus to fostering some change in the community from within. So I was writing articles in different places, engaging in different fora, and trying to get change from within. And eventually it became apparent change is not going to happen from within because the leadership structure just won't allow it to. The people at the top, the Rabbanim at the top, just won't allow it. For whatever reason, either they consider it embarrassing or because they're self-interested, or for whatever reason, they just, it's not going to happen. So what I shifted my focus to was basically forcing change to come from the outside and creating a space where if you're someone who's been chewed up and spat out by the inside, whether you're religious or not, this is not just for people who are formerly from, this is for people who are from also. I get calls from people who say, listen, I've been living with this for 5 years now, and I just can't anymore. I need justice, right? So that didn't exist previously. You couldn't get it. So in shifting the approach that Xhaka took from trying to affect change within the inside to sort of creating a space where people who are looking for help can get it, the Child Victims Act was a natural part of that. So in ensuring that people can seek justice against the people and institutions that had harmed them, we were creating an outside avenue for people to get justice that was denied them in the community, whether from Bati Din or from Rabbanim or from, just heads of institutions that had been a part of enabling their abuse or protecting their abusers.
But I remember the very first time I was presented with a situation of sexual abuse within our community. It's very hard for the average person. I'm going to also call a rabbi an average person as well. It's very hard for an average person to get your head wrapped around such things because we always grow up believing that happens elsewhere, not here. And so sometimes, we've had cases where when the lawsuits were opened up much later or the consequences occurred much later, that sometimes you have to ask yourself, were the people operating under rules that at the time were considered appropriate, or were they fooling themselves at that time? And so sometimes with these outside efforts, it does create a real dissonance with the people in charge, the people who are in charge today of organizations that may have made a mistake 20 years ago or whatever of that nature. It's complicated. I wish that all Rabbanim, and I wish that all Jewish leaders, and I wish all the Jewish followers were as aware of what, unfortunately, things we'd like to look the other way about.
So the RCA actually recently has begun a series of educational events for its membership. And I would encourage any members of the RCA who are watching this, when you get the emails telling you about these events or providing you links to the recordings, watch them. They're very good. In terms, it's interesting. It was a criticism that we got very frequently before the Child Victims Act passed. Of it's kind of unfair to institutions to allow them to be sued for stuff that happened many years ago. In many cases, the actual administrations have moved on, have turned over completely. To that point, my answer always was, well, first of all, if an institution has a mortgage over 30 or 50 years, right, just because the administration changes and the accountants change and the people who sign the contracts are no longer there or no longer alive, doesn't mean that the bank isn't going to foreclose on your building if you don't pay your mortgage. The other point is institutions build on their own legacies, right? Especially for fundraising. I mean, you take a look at an institution like Yeshiva University that very proudly says it's been around for over 100 years. Well, during that 100-year period, there was a lot of other stuff that happened aside from the education of Rabbanim and college students. There was abuse that happened, and that doesn't matter any less than any of the good stuff that came out of YU. But to address your point about Rabbanim who just, as you said, I consider too, I think that's a reasonable assessment to say that the average rabbi is an average person when it comes to dealing with this, not any more or less qualified than anybody else. In that sense, though, like my recommendation typically is, Rabbanim have to understand, and I say this with due respect to both you and everybody else watching, Rabbanim have to understand that much in the same way that they're not qualified to consult on neurosurgery, they're not qualified to consult on this either. And if they're presented with a case of sexual abuse, their role is to be a support for the person going through it, but to point them toward experts, qualified experts that have a lot of experience in this area, licensed therapists or organizations that deal with this law enforcement, and say, listen, that for that part, you need to go to people who can actually help you. We're here to support you through the process as an emotional and spiritual pillar to be there for you as you go through something difficult and traumatic. But these are the people that you need to consult with in terms of getting expert advice.
And then I can't agree with you more. I am very fortunate to have had a very close relationship with Rabbi Gedalia Dov Schwartz Zatzal, who did consult with experts, who did have halachically felt it would be appropriate to contact authorities when there was abuse taking place. And so it is something, and it's also something that rabbis are learning, not just about sexual abuse, but about mental health issues as well, that things that we used to think if you just talk a little bit about it, we can resolve it, have gotten much more complicated. And at the same time, experts have gotten much better at addressing, and therefore we turn to experts such as yourself and others. I've spoken with Rabbi Yankee Horowitz about his book that he was able to get into the Chassidish community, which was a first step, and I'm sure there are many more steps to take place as well. And we're almost running out of time, but what would be your advice if I called you as a Rav and I said, there's a person who came to me who said that X number of years ago, he or she was sexually abused. What's my next step?
I would say that your next step would be to put that person in touch, to relate to that person the available resources. If that's me, if that's somebody else, if that's another organization out there, if that's a therapist out there, it pays for Rabbanim to build a relationship with these organizations, with these qualified professionals. So you sort of have a Rolodex ready when somebody asks that. So you could say, I'm really sorry to hear that. I really appreciate you trusting me enough to confide that in me. I'm here to support you to the extent that I can. Here are resources available that can support you if you're looking for help with your mental health, if you're looking for help seeking justice in the civil system, if you're looking for help seeking justice in the criminal system. These are organizations that can help you. If you have any more pressing housing or financial needs, here's an organization that can either refer you along, or here's an organization like the Ark in Chicago or Jewish Family Services resources that can, provide you with your material resources that you need, and just, I'm here anytime you need to talk. And, if you encounter any, let's say, if you encounter any problems in the community, if anybody's harassing you about this, come to me, I'll take care of it,
And I believe that advice actually is good, whether it's a rabbi who's who's been approached, a teacher, a parent, or a friend as well, that we need to know where to turn. And one of those areas, obviously, is Xhaka and yourself. And I'm going to remind everyone of the phone number of 888-4-Xhaka, ZAAKAH, which is 492-2524. And Asher, our time has run out. It's gone by very quickly, even though it's a very complicated subject. And I just want to thank you on behalf of a community for your commitment to helping others live better lives. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. And thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.